Everyone. Hope everyone is enjoying the day. So our next keynote, Peter Borsella. Let me quickly introduce him. President of Winnow Management and partner and CEO at Big Orange Square. One of the first generation CSTs or certified Scrum trainer, I must say. And he made me a CSM in 2008, long back when I was part of his class. So today, Peter will be talking about accelerated product delivery, the promise of agility beyond software. So let's hear from Peter. And Peter, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Pushkar. And good afternoon, Calcutta. I'm connecting to you from our training center here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in the US, where the sun's about to come up on a Saturday morning. I imagine some of you are getting ready for dinner soon. Pushkar and I were just talking about the lineup for this gathering. It's an honor and a privilege to join you. It's been quite a few years since I've been in Calcutta, and I certainly wish I could be with you physically today. Well, you know what? I'll go ahead and share the screen, and
go
I
ahead.
don't want to spend. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that, and this way, you can see my face and hear the expression in my voice. Okay, there we go. Let's at least look towards that. All right. So as introduced, right, we're going to explore agility beyond software. I did get a chance to hear some of the presentations that have been given so far. I heard Shipra Agrawal's presentation yesterday on supply chain, which I view as connected with my presentation today. Moving beyond software. Now, before we go too far, please allow me to explain that I'm part of two companies, right? As I was introduced, Winnow Management primarily focuses on agility and Scrum, primarily in software. And Big Orange Square, my business partner Hubert Smits and I, we bring agility and Scrum primarily to industry, the creation of physical products. And between these two companies, I've had the good fortune to experience a wide range of environments where people are trying to understand how to become more agile. And one of the questions I normally ask when I go into an organization is why? What's your interest in becoming more agile? And for many, they do this so they can get products out the door, not just faster, but actually get something completed. In itself might be a challenge for some of our products. Now, Scrum is many things, but it rests on the thinking associated with agility and lean. Scrum is many things, but at its foundation, our interpretation is that there are two foundational expectations. It's team-based and it's empirical. Team-based and empirical. And that, I believe, is revolutionary. Now, many of you have been engaged in Scrum for many years already. And at the very least, you've spent time at this conference discussing and learning more and more about agility and Scrum. But haven't we experienced and heard countless verifications that Scrum works in software? I mean, isn't there an abundance of belief that Agile is for software? Even the PMI refers to their disciplined Agile delivery approach as a software development approach. So for the short time we have together, let's venture beyond software. Now, as mentioned, right, I've had the good fortune of working in a variety of environments, all experiencing the positive impacts of Agile and Scrum. I've had the opportunity to work with a marketing company, an automotive company, a large consulting firm that wanted to bring Scrum to their auditing division, computer chips, government agencies, education. I've worked with a church to help them adopt Scrum, construction, HR, and the list goes on and on. And what I found is that there's a common misunderstanding. While speaking to other trainers and coaches, that if you want to use Scrum, but you're not building software, then just use Scrum. It's simple. But our experience has shown that it's not a deeply thoughtful response, and there's little or no consideration for the specifics of the product in question. And our experience has shown that non-software organizations that attempt to move to Scrum by just using Scrum, they struggle, sometimes to the point where they give up. So let's home in on one particularly challenging space as an example. Industry, right? Physical product delivery. That's pretty far removed from pure software. Now, keep in mind that I believe there are these two foundational aspects of Scrum that need to be considered thoughtfully if we're going to venture beyond software: team-based and empirical. So first, what does it mean to be team-based? Well, our teams historically were reflecting this classic V model structure. V, shaped like a V, right? And you can see in the top left, we start with requirements. And if we're building something big, those requirements get broken out into design documents, and those design documents are categorized by the different disciplines like mechanical, electrical, software, and then each of those component areas goes off and works through the specific detail specifications for their areas, and then they start to construct those elements. And down by the bottom of the V shape, right, they now start to integrate those components, but you can see the large integration on the right there as we're coming up, right? This is when all the components start coming together to try to make a functioning product. And then there's extensive integration testing, of course, and connecting with supply chain, getting manufacturing prepared, all so that we can mass produce. Now, please note that what is assumed first, the requirements and how that will be built, that's validated last, validated later. And integration problems show up late, therefore, and if we want to change anything, it's hard and expensive. Now, this doesn't mean that model doesn't work for some organizations. I was up at 3 this morning so I could hear David Snowden talk about how, hey, if waterfall's working for you, then keep using it. But even if it works, if you will, they will still typically see costly integration problems showing up late. And the cost of those problems might be acceptable to the organization, such as this example from NASA, the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Here you can see how the V model plays out in practice with the different columns representing the different phases of product development and delivery. You've all seen examples such as this. But what do our teams look like in such a model? Well, most likely, they are component teams. Component teams, teams of specialists that need to hand off their work to other teams of specialists and eventually integrate everything together, sometimes months after the work has been completed. So for example, whole teams of programmers, whole teams of testers, whole teams of architects, etc. But if we want to address the risks presented in the classical delivery structure, we need to carefully create our teams that will work on this product. Now, I'm sure you've already heard the Agile analogy of the customer wanting a full slice of cake, a full slice of the product, right? You slice up and down, you don't slice across. Well, coming from an Italian heritage, I'd rather talk about lasagna. myself, right? So when I go into my favorite Italian restaurant and I order lasagna, of course, I want a whole slice delivered. I don't want the server to come over and drop a wet noodle on my plate, and then I wait for them to come back and pour some sauce, and then I wait for them to come back and add some cheese, and then all those components have to be assembled and verified, but the noodle's already cold by the time that happens, so I need to go back for some rework, etc., etc. No, of course not. I want the whole experience. And we can come closer to that whole experience when we create, instead, a feature team. So our feature teams now have all the skills needed to get the job done. Teams of developers, right, the generic term to describe whatever skill might be needed. Now, our feature teams, composed of cross-functional developers, right, using this generic term to indicate whatever skill is needed, right, can be represented graphically here, but of course, if I want to start thinking about all the skills, I have to recognize the full value chain, the full value chain, everything that's going to be needed. Now here is an industrial team, right? The skills present to realize the full value chain, from delivery start to finish, product design, manufacturing, various engineering disciplines, supply chain management, manufacturing, service in the field. All right, so let me just jump back to my software feature team, right, that you can see there. All the skills present for the full value chain. It's the same idea. Design and architecture, coding, configuration, verification, all types of testing, deployment considerations, support. Now remember, this isn't how teams have traditionally been structured. Remember, our architects were separated, but now we have them in our teams working on emergent architecture with their teammates. Remember, our testers were separated, sometimes even outsourced, but now we have them in our teams working collaboratively with other skills. Remember, our deployment activities were controlled by the data center in a locked room, but now we have DevOps and even DevSecOps calling us to work together. And that's what allows us to consider working more like this, right, where we have teams of cross-functional contributors working together. And that carries forward for industry too. But we still have to design these teams thoughtfully and carefully to understand the full value chain. Now, one way we can divide up the work if we're building something physical, this happens to be a medical device, is to create component teams where we've divided our teams into product components where each component is not an entire slice of the product. So of course, our alternative that we're looking for is create feature teams. Now, our interpretation from the Scrum Guide is that you indeed need whatever skills are necessary to deliver a completed product. That's not in dispute. However, we've all been taught that you need to keep your teams together longer. There are valid benefits to keeping your teams together longer. They learn how to work together, build confidence and trust, etc. But what we found from our experience is that the specific team configuration may change over time. This is a map that I had in my office years ago in my first exposure to Scrum at a startup company. And at that time, we launched into Scrum by the book, meaning all we had was some of the original writings about Scrum in the early 2000s. This board of sticky notes represents all of the teams that we had in place. So each vertical line that you see there of sticky notes represents a different Scrum team. And every sprint, we use this to visualize and understand what team configuration changes were needed for that sprint. We changed team members quite a bit. And it wasn't until we started going to Scrum gatherings that we were told, hey, you shouldn't do that. You need to keep your teams together longer. But we were just responding to the needs of the product environment we were in. And while we were wildly successful with our Scrum implementation, who knew we were doing it wrong? It's a bit of sarcasm, of course. People telling us, no, you shouldn't do that. But that's what we needed to be successful. Now let's look at the manufacturing engineer as an example of a skill needed by all the teams, right? This is the model where we've taken a medical device and we've broken it out by different cross-functional teams that can deliver an entire slice of product functionality. But notice every team needs a manufacturing engineer. You can see that skill there at the bottom of each team. Is a manufacturing engineer for a physical product a full-time team member from the very beginning? Remember, manufacturing is something that logically comes late. Having them full-time dedicated from the very beginning might not be financially or technically reasonable. But what would be reasonable is to have that engineer engaged from the very beginning. Now, engaged how? Well, there's lots of opportunities. Without being a full-time team member, there's sprint planning, there's the sprint review, there's daily scrums, there's product backlog refinement. So here's what that might look like graphically. Now, this is time moving left to right. And I remember Mr. Snowden earlier in the day saying, hey, if you're going to have a framework or explain something and you can't sketch it out on the back of a napkin, it's probably too complicated. So I'm hoping that this is a fairly straightforward representation of team dynamics and team configuration over time. So moving left to right. The orange and yellowish bands represent the different skills needed. And the thickness of the band represents how much of a contribution might be needed. So if you look to the left, you'll see we have customer development over there. That's the general idea around, hey, focusing on the customer, making sure we're going to be building the right things, making sure that our product selection is appropriate to meet our customers' needs. And then next to that, product design and development, and then QA and testing, and then supply chain, and then manufacturing. Right? So there is still that logical flow that's presented here. But look at something like manufacturing here towards the middle and back half. Notice the thickness of the manufacturing contribution there. In other words, manufacturing is contributing a lot in that phase of our product delivery. But look to the left, where we have customer development and product design and development. Notice manufacturing and supply chain and others, they're still contributing. They're still engaged. They may not be a full-time dedicated team member, but they're still engaged, they're participating. And if you look all the way to the right, when manufacturing is moving along, you can still see the other skills engaged in some way, even though in a smaller contribution. Now, this type of map, which does move left to right, allows us to understand how something like the NASA model, which has some very important structural elements that they're not going to give up, can still function but we're changing the team structure expectations by bringing all the skills together, and how that structure of the team might change over time. Here's an example in practice. Here's a product delivery map with time moving left to right. The yellow sticky notes above the white sheet represents the quarters. So you can see there's a long running delivery. This is from a company that makes computer chips. Now, putting this map up on the wall alone is helpful, right? It allows everyone to see the big picture. It's stored in a conference room where anyone can drop by and inspect it. But then we add a daily Scrum of Scrums. Now, Scrum of Scrums, is not a formal part of Scrum, but it's a common practice where the different areas come together. But we set some expectations here where all the different areas from start to finish of the value chain are required to participate in this daily Scrum of Scrums. Now, let me restate that. All the different areas across the timeline are required to participate. Now, in this case, the organization is working out expectations of this roadmap to deliver and where different items might fall on this long-running endeavor. And a comment is made in one of these dailies by the chip designers about the packaging that will be used for this particular chip. Now, the supply chain representative, who is now in this daily checkpoint, raises a concern about the planning the planned packaging, and says, hey, that packaging won't be available for 6 to 12 months. There's a shortage. So we either get our order in now or consider different packaging. Now, in the past, that supply chain person wouldn't have even heard about the packaging until it was time to manufacture the chip. But now we've prioritized an early delivery for supply chain, knowing that procurement concerns need to be addressed ahead of what would have been a lengthy delay and would have added to our timeline and plans in a manner that would have caused more frustration, but now we can do something about it. And that sticky note wall, right, eventually gets recorded into a spreadsheet for retention purposes and printed out. But that simple approach of getting all areas engaged shaved 6 months off the final delivery. Now, note that we didn't ask supply chain to be part of a specific Scrum team, but to be engaged throughout. Later, when we get closer to mass production, supply chain may end up leading the effort, and we might not have as much representation from the designers. We don't abandon the basic structural elements of Scrum. We're instead seeking to understand how to interpret them for our particular product environment. So some of the basic structures, right, include things like maintaining a healthy product backlog, a strong definition of done. So some people have told us, well, we're building hardware, we don't have user stories, we don't do things like that. Well, why not, right? We can still write user stories for our product backlog. This example is taken from work being done by a COVID-19 volunteer group that we're working with that is making CO2 sensors for classrooms so teachers can monitor air quality. Now, please note that the delivery requested is useful information here. And we'll come back to that idea in just a bit. And please note, we also have acceptance criteria. It just might look a little different, right? With continued refinement, we can break down the original request into smaller pieces of delivery. Now, please note there are technical product backlog items that need to be addressed too. We see this in software when the developers raise technical items that need to be addressed, even if the product owner didn't realize the need themselves. Here's the result of a discussion around the definition of done. Please note some odd things, right? A BOM, a bill of material. That's part of their definition of done. In other words, the parts list, the supplies have to be documented. Assembly instructions as part of this team's definition of done. And if you're not familiar with the term, definition of ready, right, which we have here too, is a list of what we need to have in place before we can work on a product backlog item, before the item is ready, if you will, for attention in the sprint. Now note some of the considerations for ready, such as having parts ordered. So let's look more closely at what our product backlog items are requesting and how that might tie to a sprint goal. So here's our industrial feature team. All the skills present to realize the full value chain is what we saw before. Now that we've looked at the significance of team-based, let's look at the significance of empiricism. Now, empiricism calls us to evaluate what we are proposing or theorizing and validate it through experience. A design document cannot be validated through experience until the thing is actually built and delivered sometime later. So how can our design turn into something inspectable, if you will, or empirical when we're delivering something physical? So that's what we focus on when we think about empiricism. I know Snowden says empiricism is what worked for me last time, but we're calling our product people to steer and to deliver by inspecting the actual product often and early. Sprint decomposition has to account for that. If my sprint goal is to deliver something that's going to be inspectable, I have to account for that in the details. So in normal fashion, we bring product backlog items into sprint planning. Accepted items are decomposed into tasks. In normal fashion, we also continue product backlog refinement during the sprint, so work is ready for the next sprint. So let's look more closely at this application of empiricism and how that shows up in a physical environment. Now, if the purpose of each sprint is to deliver increments of potentially releasable product functionality, we must ask the question, what does releasable or shippable mean when you're not building something like software? Now, for software, shippable, releasable, it's obvious. You need to show something usable to the customer. But what does it mean if you're not delivering software? Well, we've extracted from the Scrum Guide our interpretation of a shippable increment. It's valuable. It increases our understanding, our knowledge of the product and or the process, and it's inspectable. As an example, working with a company that makes speakerphones for conference rooms. In the old days when we used to have meetings in a conference room around a speakerphone, their first iterations produced desktop speakerphones made of cardboard. They weren't functional, of course, but they addressed questions about form and fit that could be inspected. Another example, working with a company that makes cash machines for banks. If you go into a bank to deposit a stack of cash, the teller no longer sticks those bills into a drawer. Instead, they place the cash into a machine that flips through the bills, assessing the denominations and quantities, and drops the cash into a safe and prints a receipt. Now, this company had a firm market position in the United States, but even though their engineers were in Europe, international competition was threatening their livelihood. They could not get a new competitive product out the door for years. And we asked them to evaluate their biggest delivery problem, and they said, well, that's easy. We spend a year designing a workstation. We have the customers review it. We get their approval, and then we spend the next 1 to 2 years building the workstation. And when we show it to the customer, they tell us it doesn't work for them. Their plans have changed, or they forgot to account for left-handed tellers, etc. So this company changed their approach. In the first month-long sprint of product development, they set a sprint goal of having a physical representation of a workstation that they could share with the customer, that the customer could inspect. Now, how did they accomplish this? Well, it started with a trip to the IKEA home furnishing store and a purchase of different sets of desk furniture. Inspectable. It's inspectable. They then crafted a physical design, pictured here, that could be shared with the customer. The kinks are worked out, and several months later, we get this picture. These are some of the team members in their factory with packaged product ready to ship. And here's the quote from the product development manager. "This is Agile and Scrum in hardware. 3 months of work, complete hardware, firmware, software revisions, overcoming major safety issues, R&D diving in with manufacturing to get to done, and delivering to the customer 1 week early. I am beyond amazed." And they found other benefits too, such as an opportunity to reduce their field service costs. The power supply has always been placed in the back of the unit, making each service call very time consuming since the entire front of the workstation had to be taken apart to get to the power supply. Now, since the service techs are now engaged from the beginning in the design stages, they had the opportunity to explain how most of their service calls are related to the power supply. And they ask, might we be able to move the power supply to the front of the workstation? And the designers work through some reconfiguration because it's early enough for them to do that. The workstation allows for it, and their service call costs are reduced. Ship it. Right, now, there are many practices outside the rules of Scrum that make sense, such as the practice of keeping teams together longer. But they don't work best in every situation. There's pressure to conform to an unrealistic expectation of what releasable means, such as needing to complete a sellable product increment every sprint. Now, by sticking to the rules of Scrum, because we know they work, but understanding how best to apply them in any given product situation, such as changing teams over time, or seeing the value in delivering an inspectable increment made out of cardboard, we can deliver on the accelerated product expectations of agility. Now, our slogan at Big Orange Square is twice the product in half the time, which equates to 4 times the baseline product output. Now, on a call with a company that makes road paving equipment and vehicles, we were told, your slogan should be 10 times the product expectation. They said, that's what we've seen, and 4 times the normal output is underestimating what's possible. We're looking to ship it. We just got to figure out how to do that in a creative way while still maintaining our agility. Well, I think that puts us at about our opportunity for Q&A, if there are any. I have not been monitoring the chat, but let's see if there's anything here, because I don't see our hosts here either. There we go, Pushkar.
Hi, we don't have any questions as of now. Peter, you still have time. You can continue.
Okay. Well, actually, I have covered everything I wanted to cover. If I have a couple of minutes, I just want to add, that I chose physical product because I believe that's one of the more challenging areas to bring Scrum. But I've also gotten questions from people about products that are less tangible, like a service, let's say, or you're changing your process. Right? Can you Scrum that? And I think the argument is very similar, right? We have to ask the question, what's the value of the product that we're working on? And what's the most valuable thing we can deliver in each increment that validates we're making progress, that we can inspect and verify? So I just hope that this opens up the world of possibilities for any of us here at the conference that has been reluctant or concerned about moving Scrum into a space that's not specifically software.
That's right. So Scrum in hardware and these kind of environments. Arijit has also joined now.
I think it was such a lovely session, and I was literally at a loss of words, and I was really not thinking about asking any questions. But now I was, it was really fabulous. Just one question. So Peter, it's like with your experience, and particularly the way you very nicely explained that how Scrum can go beyond IT. And we have, over the last 2 days, seen very many diversified views. Like Dave Snowden was there, Scott Amber were there. So from your perspective, like when we try to work on Scrum, and you also pointed out that when you were trying to define that what is shippable or releasable, do we really have to go back to Scrum Guide to figure out what that definition could be? Or in our given context, probably we can come up with our own definition for that?
Yeah, Arijit, a very valid question. Let me share with you what I try to do to balance that out, because I have agreed with some of the things I've heard, right? If we're so dedicated to our framework, we might not actually achieve what we're trying to accomplish because we're so focused on adhering to the framework. And I do appreciate comments earlier that Scrum is barely a framework at all. Right? It's a collection of some practices. So the reason why we want to focus on shippable and such is because, unfortunately, we've seen some contradictory behavior. We've seen some behavior that has adopted so much freedom, so little structure, that they find it acceptable to deliver something that isn't really valuable. Right? They've moved away from some of those basic concepts of why do we iterate in the first place? Why do we time box in the first place? Right? There's a focused allocation of time to do what? To deliver something of value. And I think Arijit, it's hard to move away from that. So whether we call it Scrum or not, right, we're trying to deliver value, I think, in short cycles of time. Would you agree with that?
I definitely agree with that. And kind of, you already touched upon, and I could not stop myself from asking the second question. So we are really moving to a world of servitization. Whatever comes our way, we always tend to make it as a service, and we try to make a business out of it. Now, how do you see that the entire landscape of Scrum moving hand in hand with this approach of everything becoming a service altogether?
Well, it does seem to me to be a natural progression, and this is, Arijit, I'm probably not going to use the right word for this, but I'm going to say there's a certain modularity that goes along with a service mentality, right, that allows you to break your work up into small chunks and deliver something that's completed and whole. Now, I want to be careful because I've never worked at Tesla. Okay, so I only know what I've read, and I don't own a Tesla. But what I've heard and what I've read is that even in their car design, they have focused more on modularity, kind of like a service. Right, so if a part is broken, you replace that one part without having to change the entire system. Similar to if you had a small modular service, right? You don't have to change the entire system if you've designed those services in a mindful way for modularity. So I do think it's a natural progression.
Yeah.
I guess probably on those lines, we see nowadays, even in software, we are moving into the concept of micropieces. So one small module goes out of shape or needs replacement, we simply take that particular chunk out and then replace it with something fresh. I think that was a lovely answer. Thank you so much.
So, Peter, we have one more question from the participant, Nadia. How would you measure agile maturity of team when they are mostly working on multiple project methodologies or framework?
Let's see, of a team where they are working on multiple project methodologies. So if I understand the question, a single team is working maybe on delivering something using Scrum and something using Waterfall. Is that the idea of the question, I think?
Could be Waterfall, or could be we have seen Scrum and Waterfall. Yeah, that is what Nadia says.
Right. They just clarified, Nadia, working on multiple methodologies. So, when a question like that comes up, it raises more questions for me, because what I'm, Nadia says water scrum fall, right? Waterfall, scrum fall, right?
Yeah.
So the question, how do you measure agile maturity? Well, I'd have to question if even measuring that is something that would be worth our effort. If there's still some lack of clarity around the approach we're trying to take, right? And it also raises questions for me about the difference between agility, which is how we think about things, and the methodology, which is how we do things. So could I have an agile mindset but still operate in a waterfall environment? Yeah, sure, I could. Right. So the maturity level, what are we going to be measuring? Hey, look, I'm just going to go back to the basics. The first thing I'm going to measure, the first thing I'm going to ask Nadia is it working for you? Well, what does working mean? Do you have a strong, coherent team that's focused and delivering value in frequent iterations of time? The customer's happy with what they're getting. The people are enjoying their work. We're delivering value. If those things are happening, then I'd say you'd rate pretty high, regardless of what methodology you're talking about. If you're not seeing those things, then I'd want to start understanding more about, okay, so what is keeping you from achieving those higher goals, right? Of focused, dedicated, integrated teams delivering value in short cycles. And Nadia, I get it. It happens all the time, right? We see teams that are trying to do Scrum, but they're wrapped in Waterfall, right? The rest of the organization hasn't not yet figured out what this really means to them. And so I see a comment here, right? A team might be doing a product development using Scrum, but as the application is already in production, so they always have Kanban board to work on some production bugs. Yeah, you want to mix Kanban in? See, I think there's something different here, right? Mixing Waterfall and Agile, right? That's one question. But bringing Kanban into Scrum? Sure, why not? We bring test-driven development into Scrum. We bring pair programming into Scrum. So yeah, they fit together. They fit together nicely.
Yep. Thanks, Peter. I think one more question we can take.
Oh, sure.
Can Agile be applied effectively to software or hardware combination? For example, rail automation, which also has safety standards to comply to. This is from Abhigyan.
Yes, certainly. In fact, I would say that if you're building something that has both hardware and software components, you need to be thinking about the things we talked about earlier, right? How do I get those two areas to be engaged on a regular basis? We're working with a client right now, in fact, where their software area has gone agile, if you will, right? They're using Scrum, but not their hardware area. And now they want to start focusing on changing the way they build hardware. And what we have to help them understand is they're not two different worlds, right? Because once you bring that software over to the hardware, if you haven't integrated together earlier, if you haven't discussed this beforehand, you can have all kinds of problems. Right? So we view software, as part of, hey, they're one of the key contributing skills that needs to participate. Now we'd have to talk about where in the design discussions, right, do those participations take place, but there has to be an awareness of what each area is doing so it can influence our own area. And I see that you also have safety standards to comply to. Definition of done, right? So if you're not adhering to your safety standards on regular cycles, right, you are accumulating risk that won't show up until some time later. Now, there are some that you can help, right? There's some you can help. FDA, for example, right? There is something, the FDA is not going to come in and iterate with you, the Food and Drug Administration, right? If you're building, because we just went through this here in the United States, right? This whole debate about the vaccines, right? How do you accelerate that? Well, until COVID-19, that discussion wasn't even on the table. If you're building a new drug, you have to go through the steps defined by the FDA. You can't test that early with them, but you can start running simulations. You could be prepared for the tests. You can run your own local tests. You still have the big one at the end that you can't change, but it doesn't mean we can't prepare and still do the best we can to minimize the risk that we know, right, is coming later on. So same with safety, right? Don't use that as an excuse for late delivery failure, right? Do everything you can to prove that you've tested those things out to the best of your ability before you get to the formal safety review.
Yep. So we have one more, but I think we are overshooting time now. So in the interest of time, I think we have to conclude the session, Peter. It was very informative. And any questions coming offline, we will reach out to you. Maybe folks can ping you directly through a direct message and we can talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, again, it's your Saturday evening. Such appreciation that you're taking your Saturday out to do this. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for your time.